My daughter is a serial killer. I just found out she may be something much worse. My daughter is a serial killer. It took me a long time to be able to say this. Long after the police came to her house when we were visiting. After they found the graveyard and abandoned field behind her house, bodies arranged in 3 wide circles like some kind of macabre fairy rings. After they told us just how many people she had killed, a number so high, I cannot even begin to understand how she managed it at 29. It was 2 years after she was put on death row I finally said those words to my wife. Our daughter is a serial killer. People always say female serial killers were rare and not as bad as male serial killers. But Fiona was right up there with Bundy and Dahmer when it came to the brutality of her kills. She was no less violent, depraved or cruel. The collection of her victims' hearts she kept in her fridge was every indication of that, and so were the coroner's reports that each victim had been kept alive for days, tortured, starved before Fiona finally killed them. It was a mercy in the end for them. Death. Nobody would want to live in the aftermath of what she did. The cop told me that the coroner had been gray when she said this. That in 25 years of policing work he had never seen anything this awful. Some nights I still wake up in terror from nightmares of what she did. The strangest thing about all this was that Fiona was a tiny little thing. The police were utterly flummoxed as to how she had managed to do any of this. Worse still, they couldn't figure out just how she had killed these people. The cuts were so clean. Like a surgeon's hand. But there was nothing in the world that could have made these cuts. No scalpel or knife. All their organs had been removed and then they had been neatly stitched back up again. When they opened the stitches up, they found the insides of the victims had been tattooed with hundreds of lines in a language no one could decipher. My daughter is not a medical professional. She is not a tattoo artist. She only speaks 2 languages, English and Spanish. We avoided the press, but that didn't mean the articles wouldn't be written. And the articles came. Articles where they questioned what kind of childhood she had. What kind of parents we were. They dug through everything about our family and were probably disappointed to find that we were your run-of-the-mill, all-American family, so they made things up through speculation. Perhaps we were too boring. Perhaps the normalcy was the problem. Or perhaps we were just very good at covering our tracks. Either way, the fallout was that my wife and I lost our jobs. We were accosted on the streets. Our tires were flattened multiple times and 3 times I've had to remove graffiti from the sides of our house calling us unspeakable things. My son couldn't handle it. He and his wife had to change their names and leave the state. We couldn't do that though. Who would visit Fiona in prison if we left? I know people wanted to think Fiona was an oddball. That these killer tendencies had manifested in her because she was weird, a loner of sorts. No. Fiona was a popular kid. She was a great daughter, never missed a chance to come visit and help us. She was a cheerleader and did well in school. She had a group of friends she grew up with. She even married her childhood sweetheart. I can't say she was a good wife however. Poor James, they found his head in the chest freezer in their basement. They still haven't found his body. It was the first time we visited her in prison that led me to finding what was in the attic. We were asked to try to get more information out of her. The police said that there were bodies they couldn't identify yet and that if we could get her to talk, it would help bring some peace to the victims' families. They also wanted to know how she did it. The guilt of what our child had done to other people's children made us go more than our love for our daughter. It felt like some small way of atonement, finding out what we could and helping in some way. Not that anything could make amends for giving birth to a monster. It happened on the day of the visit. We sat nervously and waited in a highly secure room within the most high-security prison. 2 wardens stood within the room with us. 2 stood outside and 4 wardens escorted Fiona, in chains, to us. When the door opened and our daughter walked in, what was alarming was to see the jovial smile on her face despite being chained at both her hands and feet. She looked remarkably well. This wasn't surprising since she had smiled coldly her entire way through the trial as well, but there was something extra obscene about how well prison suited her. She was glowing. "Hi Dad." "Mom." She sat down across the table from us. I flinched as the sound of the chains as they clinked when she moved. Fiona, my wife, Christina, managed, her hand clutched right around a tissue. Then she was crying again and Fiona's face changed a bit. She looked at Christina in concern. "Mom, please don't cry. If you knew what I know, you wouldn't be upset." Anger began to bubble up inside me. What the hell was wrong with Fiona? I had read enough now to know that serial killers were devoid of empathy or human emotions in general, but this wasn't the little girl I had raised to be a good woman. "What happened to you?" I asked, my voice quiet as I tried to keep the emotion out of it. "Why did you kill all those people?" Fiona sat back smiling and tossed her blonde hair over her shoulder. "Oh Dad, it doesn't matter. You can't stop us. No matter how much you try." I couldn't understand what she was talking about. "Fiona." My patience was wearing extremely thin. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about your father, Dad. And his father. And his father. All those generations." I swallowed hard and glanced at the prison warden. If he felt like something was weird about our conversation, he didn't show it, however. "What about them?" I asked her, concern edging its way into my voice. Fiona tilted her head quizzically and for a moment I saw her as a 6-year-old, Doing that when I taught her maths. Do you really not remember? I shifted uneasily in my seat. You know what this is. You have always known, she said leaning forward. I really. We don't like it when you lie. I stammered and then fell silent. I didn't know what kind of game she was playing. She sat back and smiled brightly. Then I swear to you my heart stopped. Suddenly the entire room darkened. Fiona's eyes went completely black. Her skin and hair turned pale white. And yet the guards kept standing there, seemingly seeing nothing, frozen in time. I tried to look at Christina but she just sat there, staring ahead of her into nothingness, a tear frozen on her cheek. My daughter opened her mouth and ash fell out as she spoke, her replaced by a deep, cold one.
Elements Rodi Koika Yiayadur Keplara. Tanu Devido Paya Emered Mistu. Aladi Gadra Devika Oru Foru Kedurai.
Those words, I knew those words. I had seen them before. My hands cold and clammy, I pushed back from the table as the chair fell away and backed myself up against a wall, terror gripping my chest. Instantly, the scene was back to normal. My daughter's face was normal, my wife's shoulders shuddered as she sobbed, still unable to speak a word, and Fiona sat there with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Shaking, I told the guard, "We are done here." My wife turned to look at me and I stared into her teary eyes. "We need to go. Now." The last thing we heard as we left the room was Fiona's laughter, once vibrant, now cold and cruel. When we got home, I waited until dinner was over and we went up to bed. I waited until Christina had taken her sleeping pill and her breathing was even enough to know she was asleep. Then, I quietly got up and made my way to the attic. I knew exactly what I was looking for. After I hauled myself up from the square-shaped opening in our ceiling into the dark, quiet room I hadn't visited since we had moved into this house, I shone my torch around. Mostly the room was full of the children's old toys and clothes, things we had been planning to give away and never got around to. Old furniture that belonged to our parents. But there, hiding in the corner of the room was the cardboard box I was looking for, the reason I had not been in this attic for years. My mouth a bit dry and my hands trembling, I walked over to it and dragged it over to myself. Then I took a deep breath and opened it. Lying inside was a series of old, leather-bound journals I had hoped I would never ever have to look at again. It was the names and detailed torture and murders of every person my family had killed. The bloody and brutal legacy of the witch-finder generals that we used to be. Except, there were no witches. You already know this if you know anything about the witch trials. What witch-finder generals were hunting was much, much more ancient. They were hunting the old gods. You see, this world belonged to the ancient ones long before it became our home. It belonged to beings that were so powerful, they terrified us. But slowly as the world changed and less people believed in folk tales, so did they stop believing in the tales of the old gods. And what are gods without prayer and fear to keep them powerful and immortal? So they began to live amongst us to adapt to their mortality. Less powerful. Less able to protect themselves. And we used that adaptation against them. We hunted them in the name of her own god. We told ourselves that this is what needed to be done to keep our species safe. That we were servants of God doing his bidding. My family carried this tradition on for years, finding what was left of the ancient ones and decimating them. All the way till my father was born and refused to train in the ways of his father. My father killed his father when he was only a teenager. He was trying to protect a girl who would later become his wife. My mother. He kept the journals. He kept them to tell me of the history he was ashamed of, to tell me that I must never go down this route. I had read them years ago and shuddered at the amount of lives my family had stolen. And I never had. I had lived a good life and raised a good family. Or so I had thought. I turned the yellowed old sheets, reading name after name in faded ink. Finally, I found the thing I was looking for. It was there in the third journal. The last words of ancient goddess that was burned alive. Elemen Zarodi Koika Yiayadur Kaplara. Tanu Devidok Paya Emered Mistu. Aladi Gadra Devika Oru Foru Kedurai. For every one of us you kill, we will take 1,000 of you in return. Our vengeance will speak through your own blood. But the thing that made my blood run cold were the words Fiona had not said. The words that were below the ones I had just read. Sitting there written in faded old ink were the words, "Fear not your death. But what awaits every one of you after." Thanks for watching. Follow for more.